Welcome back. Let's take you to this now. In international news, the United States and Israel are expected to hold a virtual meeting today to discuss the Biden administration's alternative proposals to an Israeli military invasion of Rafah. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he's determined to get Israeli hostages held in Gaza home safely. He says the government wanted to negotiate, but the demands made by Hamas have serious implications. This as tens of thousands of people demonstrated in Jerusalem yesterday against Netanyahu's government. His cabinet has faced widespread criticism over the security failure in October that saw 1,200 people killed and more than 250 taken hostage in southern Israel. All right, joining us now with the latest from Tel Aviv is our correspondent, Alex Cadier. Alex, thank you so much for your time. So what can you tell us about this virtual meeting today between the U.S. and Israel? I mean, what are the likely sticking points supposed to be, especially in as far as the United States' alternative plan? Alex, are you there? Can you hear me? All right.
I can hear you, yeah.
All right. So, Alex, of course, we're hearing these developments now that the U.S. is going to be meeting with Israel virtually, we understand. Just talk to us about the likely sticking points. I mean, we are hearing of an alternative plan to Rafah by the United States. What can you tell us?
Yeah, well, I mean, just the fact that this meeting's organization was as tense as it was tells you a lot about how these conversations will be happening. Now, initially, this meeting was supposed to happen last week in person between U.S. officials and Israeli officials. That was cancelled by Prime Minister Netanyahu after the UN Security Council resolution wasn't vetoed by the U.S. He then asked the U.S. to reschedule the meetings. That was made public. Prime Minister Netanyahu denied it. So they went for this virtual meeting. Now, the fundamental issue here is that an operation in Rafah, according to the United States, could lead to mass casualties, and the fact that there is really very little place for these civilians to go if an operation were to happen. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday saying that the Israeli Defense Forces are preparing a plan to get those civilians out of Rafah, but where they will go is really not clear because the north of Gaza is entirely devastated and fighting continues there, and south of Gaza is the Egyptian border, which is completely shut. So at the moment, those plans will be discussed by the U.S. National Security Advisor, other officials, Minister Ron Dermer from Israel, but clearly no real plan yet for those civilians in Rafah.
And I want to stay on that point, Alex, in terms of what is currently happening in Gaza now. We have, of course, seen the visuals and the destruction, caused by Israel, particularly on the Al-Shifa hospital. Just talk to us about what you know there.
Well, 2 weeks of fighting between the Israeli forces and Hamas fighters and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters in and around the Al-Shifa hospital have led to real devastation. As you said, on those pictures, you can see that buildings in and around the hospital are destroyed. The main surgical unit of the hospital, where the intensive care unit used to be, has been destroyed. The general surgery, the orthopedics, as well as the emergency department, which were all in another building, have also been destroyed. So really devastating scenes there from the Al-Shifa hospital, Gaza's largest hospital, the second time it's been raided by Israeli forces. But the IDF say it has been used as a military outpost by Hamas, by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and that is why they launched that operation, killing 200 fighters, they say, and arresting 500 linked to Hamas. That's according to the Israelis. But clearly that devastation will have massive knock-on effects for the population of Gaza, because even during that raid, the WHO says 21 patients died, and medical aid just not getting to that hospital for those who need it. So really devastating scenes at the Al-Shifa hospital.
And I want to just change course a bit and talk about what we are seeing in terms of, these protests that have been held in Jerusalem. I mean, we have seen widespread unhappiness, on the ground, mainly leveled at Benjamin Netanyahu. His cabinet facing widespread criticism too, over the security failure on the 7th of October. So what is happening currently now in terms of those protests and the unhappiness that goes with it?
Well, there's a real shift, actually, in public reaction here in Israel, a shift against Prime Minister Netanyahu. But I think the most important thing to point out is that the families of those hostages being held by Hamas in atrocious conditions in Gaza, well, those families are now pointing the finger directly at Prime Minister Netanyahu, some saying that he needs to resign, some saying that he is standing in the way of a deal and torpedoing a deal. So a lot of public pressure, those families joining with the anti-government movement. That's not something we've seen before. The protests in Tel Aviv here on Saturday and the ongoing protests in Jerusalem have been the largest since October 7th, really ramping up that pressure. Now, a criticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu, protests against the government, do not mean that there is opposition, widespread opposition in Israel to this war. There is still very broad support for Israeli forces pursuing their goal of destroying Hamas. But before they do that, there is increased pressure to get a deal to release those hostages.
Very quickly, Alex, if you could just bring us up to speed and just make it all make sense in terms of what we are seeing in as far as those high-level talks that are expected to happen between the U.S. and Israel. I mean, not too long ago, the Biden administration approved more weapons for Israel. And we know, of course, that the two sides, the U.S. and Israel, there is a bit of a rift, there is a bit of a shift. But how do we make sense of the continued, assistance by the U.S. To Israel, particularly in as far as, weapons are concerned?
Well, certainly that weapons deliveries was very heavily criticized around the world, but you have to separate Israel's operation from now on and the clear rift between the US and Israel on what will happen in Rafah and the US's continued support for Israel's right to defend itself. And that will be the argument made in Washington, is that weaponry is still needed for Israel to defend itself, but they will be prosecuting a war in Gaza. They will be heavily bombing Gaza, as we've seen, and actually specifically the 1,800 2,000-pound bombs that were sent by the United States have been linked, according to the Wall Street Journal, to mass casualty events in Gaza. So clearly that rift has not yet affected US support and US weaponry going to Israel. It may do so in the future, particularly as we see that relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu and President Joe Biden worsening. One of the things to look out for, we mentioned it already, those talks about Rafah between the United States and Israel, a lot of growing impatience in Washington. That may change the policy in the next few weeks, even if it hasn't changed it in the immediate future.
And of course, these developments, especially the mounting pressure, that is against Netanyahu, we understand, of course, that he's undergone surgery. I mean, this couldn't possibly be a good time for him. Just talk to us about what you can tell us about that particular surgery.
Well, the Prime Minister's surgeon saying that the surgery was successful. He was doing a routine medical checkup on Saturday. A hernia was found, and it was decided that the Prime Minister had to undergo a basic surgery within the next 24 hours. So he did that last night. He had the War Cabinet meeting scheduled for Sunday. Then he did a press conference. Then he went to hospital. We understand from his doctors that the procedure was very successful and that the Prime Minister was up and walking and up and speaking to his family, I should say. Now, speaking to medical sources, they say this is a very straightforward procedure, one of the most basic surgical operations you can receive. So they can imagine maybe a couple of days bed rest for Prime Minister Netanyahu. But you're absolutely right to say that the timing of this will have been very difficult with that mounting pressure, with the high-stakes ceasefire talks in Cairo, with the high-stakes Israeli officials talking to the US counterparts as well. But we understand the Prime Minister has had a successful operation and is now going to make a full recovery.
Alex, thank you so much for that update. Of course, Alex Cadier, correspondent, live there for us from Tel Aviv. This ahead of the meeting there, the virtual meeting between the United States and Israel, expected to take place today, of course, to discuss the Biden administration's alternative proposals to an Israeli military invasion of Rafah. We'll give you an update there in as far as how that meeting goes and what was discussed.